Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Coastal Studies Institute. This is the public presentation of research of the 2018 Outer Banks Field Site class. The Outer Banks Field Site is a joint enterprise of Coastal Studies Institute and University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. It's a semester-long academic program that combines academics, internships, multiple community interactions, and also a cooperative and collaborative field-based research project. And what you're going to see today is the results of that research project. There's a lot of people who have helped this year, a lot that we would like to thank. Our community advisory board that has been terrific in terms of sharing their knowledge about both the subject matter and the community and interacting and giving feedback to the students. The town of Nags Head has been great. This is a collaborative effort with them, and Holly White, Todd Kraft, David Ryan, Andy Garman have been fabulous about sharing their time and their knowledge. The CSI community here, faculty and staff have been terrific. All of the internship mentors who have helped our students learn so much through on-the-job experiences have all been great. And finally, and particularly, the Outer Banks faculty. My co-director, Lindsay Dubbs, Linda DeAnna, and Corey Adams have been terrific for all the students and for the whole community here. We'd also like to thank UNC Chapel Hill, the Institute for the Environment, the Ecology, Environment, and Energy Program, and Study Abroad all helped us a lot and make this possible. A couple things about the research you're about to see. This is a complex topic. There are no easy answers, and we want to stress that the way we run this program is it's not the student's job to study something and tell everybody what they should do. It's their job to use rigorous academic analysis to sort of shed light on what the trade-offs are and what we know that help other people make good decisions. In other words, these guys aren't coming in to sort of spend 4 months here and tell the community what the right thing to do is. They're here to say, we looked at this from the standpoint of social and natural sciences. Here are some things we learned, and we hope this lets you learn more than you knew before. So that's the setting here. And then what you're going to see is not just what they've learned, but how they've learned it. So there's going to be some methodology and some statistics. So of course, this means you can all look forward to a particularly exciting time. And then I'd also like to say that this is a work in progress. We're always very impressed by how much these guys get done in 4 months. 4 months is not much time for a research project, especially since these guys are taking a full class schedule, going to internships 2 days a week, hanging out at the beach as often as they can, and participating in a lot of other activities. So they've done a huge amount, but if they had another 3 or 4 months, they'd do even more. They'd certainly be interested in learning from you guys your perspectives on wastewater and stormwater, or generally natural resource management on the Outer Banks. So please feel free to find them and talk to them after this is over. And with that, I would like to say, please hold questions till the end. We will have plenty of time for questions, but let's let them get through it before we do that. And with that, I'd like to introduce the Outer Banks Field Site class of 2018.
Hi, everyone. My name is Catherine Bell. I'm from Clemens, North Carolina. I'm a senior at UNC Chapel Hill, and I interned at Quibel & Associates this semester.
Hi, my name is Miriam Consa. I'm a junior from Charlotte, North Carolina. I interned with Holly White at town of Nags Head.
Hi, I'm Connor Hwachin. I'm a senior from Baltimore, Maryland, and I interned at the Outer Banks Center for Dolphin Research.
Hi, I'm Lynn Tran. I'm a senior and studying environmental studies, and I grew up in Durham, North Carolina, and I interned with Sam Walker at the Outer Banks Voice and Jam Media Solutions.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Kendrick. I'm a junior from Atlanta, Georgia, and I interned at the Dare County District Attorney's Office.
Hey y'all, I'm Alex Kellogg, originally from Orlando, Florida, and a senior in environmental studies at UNC Chapel Hill, and I interned with the North Carolina Coastal Reserve and Estuarine Research Reserve.
Hey, I'm Emma Seschel. I'm a senior from Smithville, North Carolina, and I also interned with Holly White at the town of Nags Head.
Hey, I'm Harris Kopp. I was born in Texas but raised in the mountains, and I'm a senior at Chapel Hill studying environmental studies, and I interned under Aaron McCall at the Nature Conservancy.
I'm Autumn Pollard, and I'm a junior, and I'm from Winterville, North Carolina, and I interned with Ann Daisy at the Dare County Soil and Water Department.
Hello, my name is Denisha Byron. I'm from Fayetteville, North Carolina. I study environmental science, and I interned at CanSand OBX with Herb Council.
Hi, I'm Kendall Kane. I'm a junior from Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and I interned with the town of Mania.
Hi, I'm Emma Carlock. I'm a senior from Jamestown, North Carolina, and I interned at the Outer Banks Center for Wildlife Education.
And I'm Jen Allen. I'm a junior from Shelby, North Carolina, and I interned at the North Carolina Coastal Federation. All right. Welcome to CSI. My classmates and I are so glad that you chose to join us here today for our capstone presentation on environmental change and septic systems in Nags Head, local perspectives, and impacts to water quality and quantity. Like I said, I'm Jennifer Allen, and I'll be walking you through the presentation we have for you today and our introduction. So every study begins with an observation, and for us, this was that forces driven by global climate change coupled with human development have resulted in increased flooding and deteriorating water quality in Nags Head due to increased interactions between septic systems and water reservoirs. So our study sought out to, one, see if the historical data supports this observation. Has there been potential in the past for septic systems and water reservoirs to be interacting? Two, assess the current state of water quality. Is water contaminated, and how much of this can be linked to humans? And three, assess the local perspectives. See how people in Nags Head are feeling about wastewater management, flooding, and water quality. My colleagues will get into these methods a little more in a second, but for now I just want to note that when I'm talking about water quality, we're just talking about that of groundwater and water reservoirs such as the ocean, the sound, and drainage ditches, and not drinking water, which is filtered and distributed by the local municipalities. All right, so I'll just take you through the presentation we have for you today. First, I'm going to talk about the area that we studied, why we chose it, and what makes it unique. Then my colleagues will introduce you to the critical knowledge you'll need to understand the full context of our study. Next, we will dive into the methods and the results of each research approach, those being our historical water level study, our water quality field study, and our assessment of local perspectives. Lastly, we will discuss our overall results and conclusions, and then make recommendations for the future. And then we will open the floor to questions from you, the audience. So, where did our study take place? As you can see, Nags Head is located on the Outer Banks of North Carolina in Dare County, about halfway between Corolla and Ocracoke. It is also just east across the bridge from where we are today on Roanoke Island at the Coastal Studies Institute, and it is the most southern municipality on the peninsula before you reach the Oregon Inlet and Hatteras Island. The majority of our data actually came from a particular area of Nags Head known as the Gallery Row subwatershed. This watershed is nestled by the Atlantic Ocean to the east and the Nags Head Woods to the west, and it runs all the way from Bonnet Street up to 8th Street and the Nags Head-Kill Devil Hills line. We chose this particular area because it's very prone to flooding, and this has increased in recent years due to the rise in development and impervious surfaces around it. It is also, if you were to think of this area as a bowl, the Gallery Row subwatershed would be the bottom, meaning that all water and runoff from all over come to this place, saturating the soil and causing water to remain on the surface, therefore flooding. Additionally, Nags Head's economy is very reliant on tourism. And people come to Nags Head particularly because of the nice beaches and the clean water quality. Unfortunately, this is being threatened by these interactions between this excess ground and surface water and septic systems. So Nags Head is facing threats both ecologically, as water quality and the environment seem to be deteriorating, and economically, as the things that bring people to this area are becoming less and less pristine. But now I'm going to hand it over to Emma to talk to you more about these topics.
Thanks, Jen. So it's really important to understand coastal hydrology as a way to contextualize our research and to better understand why we've chosen to study these factors. Hydrology is defined as the ways that in which water is moved within Earth systems. So that includes how water is held in different reservoirs and how it is moved between and among these reservoirs through different fluxes. You'll see in this diagram on the left that there are a number of different reservoirs and fluxes. Some of the different fluxes include precipitation, evaporation, runoff, and infiltration. As well, we have reservoirs such as the ocean, and here in Nags Head we have both the Atlantic Ocean, and we also have freshwater and brackish sounds. We also have groundwater reservoirs that are important to understand as well. In the diagram to the right, you can see that there are two different kinds of groundwater aquifers. These are different groundwater reservoirs. A confined aquifer, as shown here, is unable to interact freely with the ground surface by these confining units. So these are made up of clay or sometimes rock. These prevent this water from interacting. And we also have groundwater aquifers, which are also known as unconfined aquifers. They are able to freely interact with the land surface and are known as the water that is held within soil particles. The water level of the groundwater aquifer is also known as the water table. Above the water table, we have the vadose zone, and this is typically unsaturated soil. An additional reservoir that we have to consider is surface water. And surface water is thought of differently from the ocean and sound, as it is primarily lakes, rivers, and drainage ditches that accumulate water, and this water flows and runs off to the ocean and sounds. On this diagram, you'll also notice that we have two wells depicted, A and B. B refers to a well that draws from a confined aquifer. This is an example of how the town of Nags Head will draw up water for drinking. And then well A is a groundwater well, which you'll hear more about during the duration of this presentation. So the hydrologic cycle is a process that happens regardless of human presence. However, it is important to understand how anthropogenic impacts influence the hydrologic cycle. For this, we've decided to conceptualize it with the socio-hydrologic cycle. Changing environmental conditions such as increases in storms, increases in the severity of flooding, and sea level rise impact how communities perceive and believe these changes. These perceptions and beliefs influence how communities deal with these problems and how they create public policies or infrastructures to mitigate these. The way that public policies are structured impact how storms, flooding, and sea level rise are dealt with in the future. Considering environmental changes, there are a number of ways in which coastlines like that of the Outer Banks will be affected. Coastlines like ours here are in a constant state of change, and this is only being exacerbated by changing global conditions. So that includes increased storm prevalence, increases in flooding, and sea level rise. In this picture on the left, you'll see that these homes and other properties are impacted by rising sea levels. And in this picture on the left, or on the right, excuse me, you'll see how flooding can impact roadways and other infrastructures like this. Because there are so many people living here in this coastal system, a number of different infrastructures will be impacted by these environmental changes. And it's important to see how these will be dealt with by mitigation strategies. Wastewater is an important one of these structures that we are going to get a little more into in the rest of this presentation. We will be talking about how the increases in development and the greater number of people here means that there's more wastewater that has to be dealt with. The wastewater treatment systems are some of the structures that are threatened by environmental changes. I'm going to turn it over to Kendall to talk to you a little bit more about wastewater and wastewater treatment.
Thanks, Emma. So it's important to understand a little bit about wastewater and the different ways in which it can be treated. When we talk about wastewater, we're talking about any of the water that's used in homes and businesses and goes down your drains or is flushed through toilets. There are a variety of ways in which this wastewater can be treated. In more urban areas, it's common for centralized systems to be used. There are also a variety of on-site wastewater treatment systems. The most prevalent here in Nags Head is septic. 80% of Nags Head is on septic systems. So the way a septic system works is any of that wastewater that's used in your home goes down your drains and is flushed down toilets, and it enters into a septic tank underground through the inlet pipe where solids settle to the bottom and bacteria that are present work to begin breaking down some of the contaminants and bad bacteria. then the liquid waste that's left leaves through the outlet pipe as effluent and enters into the leach field, where it is dispersed. And it begins to percolate through this vadose zone that Emma introduced you to in order to filter some of the nutrients and contaminants in the effluent. Some concerns that we have about the use of septic systems in this area are that even a perfectly functioning septic system can be impacted by things like environmental change. So with increased precipitation events and flooding, this normally unsaturated vadose zone can become saturated, which makes it difficult for the effluent to percolate through and be properly filtered. This can be cause for concern, as some of those contaminants are more likely to enter into things like surface water, drainage ditches, which can lead into the ocean, and it might still contain some bacteria and pathogens, which can be harmful to human health. Another concern that we have is that as the groundwater level rises, this vadose zone becomes smaller and increased interaction is possible between the leach fields and the groundwater. This can also result in eutrophication, which in short means that increased nutrients allow for increased algae to bloom, which depletes oxygen. So Nags Head has already begun a few things to combat some of these issues. They started a septic health initiative in 2000, which two of their primary goals were to conduct a water quality study and better understand a little bit about the water quality in the area, as well as the depth to groundwater across space and time. A second project that they've done in order to combat some of the water quantity concerns is efforts to lower the groundwater in order to decrease the possibility of interactions between the leach field and the groundwater, and also to decrease the negative impacts of flooding in the area. So what does all of this mean for our research project? Here on the Outer Banks, we're surrounded by water, and as such, we have a very complex and unique hydrology and topography. And we also have a lot of septic in the area. So it's important to understand how septic is affected by and can affect the environmental changes in the area. So we chose to approach this study from 3 different perspectives. First, we wanted to understand a little bit about what has been happening in the area. And so we chose to use data provided to us from that septic health initiative from the town of Nags Head to conduct a historical water level study to better understand a little bit about where the groundwater level is and how it is affected by things like season and impervious surfaces. We also wanted to understand a little bit more about what's going on in this specific area right now, so we decided to conduct a water quality field study. We identified a sub-watershed that Jennifer introduced you to earlier that's particularly prone to flooding, and we found a few locations within that area that we tested for water quality, as well as a few groundwater locations that we used for control for comparison. Lastly, we thought it was important to, in order to inform policy decisions, to better understand what local residents think about these issues. So we conducted a local perspective study where we interviewed residents in Nags Head to understand what they thought about water quality and quantity concerns and what they saw as some of the causes and the major issues. So next, Denisha will talk to you a little bit more about our historical water level study.
Thank you, Kendall. As stated by Kendall, we want to know what's been happening across the island, so that brought us to the historical water level study. We obtained this data set from the town of Nags Head through their septic health initiative. Under this initiative, they had a program called the Water Quality Monitoring Program. Through this program, they took several depth to groundwater measurements, which we'll be explaining how that works later in this presentation. Our interpretation of the historical data set focused primarily on changes both seasonally and over time. So our major goal was to determine, has water level been changing through Nags Head over time, and does it change the same across the landscape? And this brings us to our hypotheses. Our first hypothesis was, is water level changing seasonally? and how it changes over time. Our second hypothesis was, is water level increasing? And if so, by how much? So let's jump right into it. Here's an overview map of all of the historical groundwater wells that were present across Nags Head. So let's go in a little bit deeper. So here's the first 3 historical groundwater wells in North Nags Head. Central Nags Head, here's another 3. 2 are on top of each other a little bit, but that is fine. And last but not least, South Nags Head, 2. So that gives us a total of 8 historical groundwater wells that we were able to interpret some information from. So when groundwater measurements were made, in our historical analysis of depth to groundwater measurements, we define a sampling event as at least 4 groundwater wells were sampled at that time. So with this, there were 67 sampling events total. Altogether, that gave us 489 depth to groundwater measurements. And if we take a look across the seasons, we see that the sampling events were not regular and that winter was rarely sampled. So in order for us to interpret more information about the hydrologic cycle, as Emma stated, we would need more baseline sampling over time. So finally, I get to explain depth to groundwater. A depth to groundwater measurement is taken from the land surface to the top of the groundwater table. And for more information, the gray area is the depth and the blue area is the water table. And we see that there is an inverse relationship between the two. We see that a larger depth to groundwater indicates a water level that is much lower. And then on this side, we see that, on the right side, we see that the groundwater table has risen, which indicates a higher water level. So now that we're somewhat familiar with the depth to groundwater, let's jump right into our first hypothesis, which we looked at seasonal changes over time. So on the y-axis, we have the mean depth to groundwater. Keep in mind the last slide where I said that the land surface begins at the top. So therefore, the 0 value is the land surface. Our data are arranged by water year and by season in chronological order of how they occur throughout the year. So green is spring, summer is depicted in yellow, and orange is fall. So as I stated, our first hypothesis looked at seasonal changes in depth to groundwater. So viewing the summer, we expected the water level to be closer to the surface. And we found that in most of our trends of the groundwater wells, we found that most of the trends indicated that they were much lower, indicating a water level that was not closer to the surface, as we expected. So this refuted our hypothesis. Next, we will have Autumn talking about overall water level changes.
So I'll be talking about our second hypothesis and how water level changed over time throughout the historical data set. So the measured rate of relative sea level rise in Duck, North Carolina is between 1/10 and 2/10 of an inch per year. And although sea level rise and an increase in depth to groundwater does not have a direct one-to-one relationship, we know that sea level rise and groundwater increases sea level rise will affect groundwater increases over time. So We expected that over the historical record, the depth to groundwater measurements would decrease over the historical record as a result of sea level rise. So here on the y-axis, we have the mean depth to groundwater, and on the x-axis, we have the water year. And this solid blue line indicates the overall mean depth to groundwater for the entire historical data set for all of the groundwater wells. And each of these points represents the annual mean depth to groundwater for all of the historical wells in the data set. And although each of these points varies by year, we can see that there is a negative trend in the mean depth to groundwater by water year. When looking at this R² value of about 11%, we know that there's not a very strong relationship between mean depth to groundwater and water year. But that's not surprising given the duration of the data set. So although this trend is what we expected to see, that the depth to groundwater decreased over the historical record, we know that we cannot directly attribute that to sea level rise given the duration of the data set. So water level is important to understand because septic drain fields are under the ground with the groundwater reservoir. So the typical depth of a septic drain field is 24 inches in the region, and the typical separation from the bottom of the septic drain field to the top of the groundwater table is 24 inches. And this 24-inch separation is important because wastewater effluent gets further treated in the soil here. And when analyzing the historical record, we looked at where any measurement did not meet, when any depth to groundwater measurement did not meet this total of 48 inches. So when analyzing the historical record of the entire 489 depth to groundwater measurements, 49% of those measurements did not meet this separation requirement. And we know that as sea levels continue to rise, there will only be more instances in which the separation requirement will not be met, which will affect coastal communities like Nags Head. So in conclusion, we looked at seasonal trends in water level, and we determined that the water level did not behave in the way that we expected to. We expected that there would be a decrease in the depth to groundwater in the summertime, or an increase in water level due to the interaction between the confined and the unconfined aquifer. However, we did not really see that. Secondly, when analyzing the historical record, although we saw the trend that we expected to see, we know that we cannot directly attribute this decrease in mean depth to groundwater over time, or this increase in water level to sea level rise, given the duration of the data set. And we would need decades worth of data to be able to differentiate between natural variations like precipitation and water use and the long-term sea level rise. So, given that sea level rise is occurring, there will only be more instances in which the required separation from the bottom of the septic drain field to the top of the groundwater table will not be met. And this can lead to water quality concerns. So next, Harris will lead us into the water quality field study.
Thank you, Autumn. So for the water quality field part of our study, we hypothesized that after rain events, surface water reservoirs in Nags Head would see increased levels of concentrations like nutrients like nitrogen and orthophosphate, as well as increased levels of bacteria that's commonly associated with septic system leachate, such as E. coli and Enterococcus. And what you're seeing behind me right now may look familiar. It's our sampling site. Outlined in blue is the Gallery Row sub-watershed. And to the right of that is a table with our sampling dates. Before we go any further, I do want to clarify the difference between a baseline sample and a storm sample. So the first three dates, that are pictured in the table, the 5th, 10th, and 24th of October, those were all taken under relatively dry conditions where there was no rain coming down and no standing water on top of people's septic drain fields in the watershed. And for the storm samples, there was a single storm event that lasted from October 26th to 27th, and we sampled twice during that event when there was water coming down and it was enough water to actually put standing water on top of people's fields and have it run off into the surface water ditches. So we had 2 groundwater control wells. The first one in the top left of the map was up in Nags Head Woods, and the second one you can see in the bottom right, which was closer to Jockey's Ridge State Park. And we were using these groundwater wells as controls because under the assumption that since they were below the surface, they wouldn't be massively affected by runoff coming from storm events that would flow over the surface. Not like our surface water sites, pictured as these green triangles on the eastern side of the watershed. Those were all surface water drainage ditches that were literally these large cut ditches right next to the road, and they would flow in series through the eastern part of the neighborhood all the way up to the red triangle on the top right of the map, and that's the Red Drum Ocean Outfall Pipe where it would flow into the ocean. And the sampling process itself varied a little bit between surface water sampling sites and groundwater. At the surface water sites, like pictured in the middle here, this is about what they looked like on a nice sunny day with the nice, beautiful brown water. We could walk right up to them and scoop our samples right out of the water. Relative to the groundwater sampling sites, like the one pictured on the right, first we had to measure the depth of groundwater using a water level meter, which if you've never seen one is kind of just like a long drain snake with a sensor on the end that beeps really loudly whenever it hits the water. So we just feed it down there, and whenever it beeps, we record how far down it is. And then we do what Emma is doing right now, which she is using a baler to bring the water up to the surface so that we can take it back to the lab and test it. And what we were doing in the lab was we were looking for the nutrients like, again, nitrogen and orthophosphate, and the bacteria like E. coli and Enterococcus that would indicate some level of septic system interaction. We also chose to filter our samples and test for the presence of caffeine, which is taken in by humans in large quantities and shows up as waste in our septic systems. Yeah. I love Starbucks. Basically, the reason that that's important is if we see large spikes of caffeine in our data, we can be more sure that there's been some interaction with human waste rather than E. coli that's in the water just because an animal was there. So as long as we have the caffeine in our data, we can better link it to human septic system interaction. All these tests were pretty lab intensive, so thankfully I got to hand it off to Emma so she can tell you about them.
Thank you, Harris. So after we got our samples, we would bring them back to the lab. And our lab work was sectioned into 3 parts. We had our bacterial analysis, our nutrient analysis, and our filtration for caffeine. So as you can see here, these lovely trays, we use the IDEXX laboratory protocols to sample for both Enterococcus and E. coli. Up here on the top, this is going to be our Enterococcus samples, and down here is our E. coli samples. So once these samples are prepped, we incubate them for 24 hours, come back the next day and check and use a most probable number table to count for colony-forming units. So the E. coli samples down here are going to light up, are going to turn yellow when there's bacteria present. And over here on the right, we're going to use a UV light, and it fluoresces when it's present. For our nutrient samples, we use a filtration manifold, which pulls the water samples down through the filter. And for the nutrient samples, that only required about 30 milliliters of sample. But for our caffeine analysis, that was 4 liters of sample that we had to filter. And this is some of our filters here. As you can tell, there's a lot of organic matter in these water samples, and it was very time intensive. So to the parents in the audience, we're sorry we were home late for Thanksgiving break. So our caffeine was filtered. And then huge thanks to Dr. Sid Mitra, who worked in his lab to test for caffeine. We had this manifold here. This was pulled through Oasis HLB cartridges, and we diluted our samples with hydrochloric acid to take out some of the bacteria so that we can isolate this caffeine. And then here are some of our nutrient results. So as Harris mentioned, we test for orthophosphate, ammonia, and nitrate.
So here, our blue here represents our baseline sample averages. So here we have our 2 groundwater wells, and these error bars represent our standard deviations. So here in our outfall sample, our groundwater wells, you see less standard deviation, less variation in these concentrations, whereas our surface water samples, you see large variation. But all of our nutrients across the board followed this trend where under storm conditions, we see higher concentrations. So to further discuss these bacteria and caffeine results, I'm going to pass it on to Alex.
Thank you, Emma. And so I'll be talking with y'all about some of our bacteria samples. As you can see here, this is similar to the last graph on the slide. This is our E. coli sampling measured in colony-forming units on the y-axis, and the x-axis is our sampling sites. And again, the blue is baseline samples under the more calmer conditions, and the orange is storm conditions. And following our hypothesis, you can see that in storm conditions, in at least the surface water sites, the E. coli concentrations are much higher than the baseline conditions. We detected virtually no E. coli in the groundwater sampling sites. And the outfall site is not represented here because E. coli is used in freshwater systems as a water quality indicator, and Enterococcus is for marine systems. And so for the purposes of keeping it short for this presentation, we only have E. coli. And in the green here is our historic data at Wrightsville 2. And so as you can see, this suggests that historic levels of E. coli in surface water sites are similar to baseline conditions that we measured. And again, the standard deviations here represent the variation that we see in the sites. We did not have enough data at surface water 1 to put a standard deviation on there. And all this shows the larger one, as Emma had said. It just shows that there's larger variation. It doesn't necessarily point to where the E. coli is coming from. So it could be coming from septic leachate. It could be coming from an animal defecating near the surface water sites. And but the significance of this is to show that the surface water sites under storm conditions are rather contaminated with E. coli. And then the following graph is the same as the first, with the exception that the storm events are removed. This is just under baseline conditions. And this orange line here is the EPA standards for recreational waters for E. coli. And that number is about 126 colony-forming units per 100 milliliters of water. And as you can see, under baseline conditions, in 2 of the 3 surface water sites, even under the baseline conditions when it's a much smaller amount of E. coli, they exceed these thresholds. And the reason why this is significant is because during flood events, when water from these surface water sites gets into roads and Nags Head and things like that, even though they're not considered legally recreational waters, children will sometimes play in them, people walk in them to go to work, to go wherever, and can be exposed to what the EPA considers to be unhealthy levels of E. coli concentration. And even though the outfall site leading to the ocean is not on this graph, both the measures of E. coli and Enterococcus were not represented in that outfall, and we think that was likely as a result of the dissolution from ocean water. And so yes, essentially under baseline conditions, which as you can see are much smaller than storm conditions, even under those limited water events, the surface water sites are still rather contaminated with E. coli. And this personally is I think a very interesting graph in that this is our caffeine analysis, which with the exception of groundwater 2, which showed no caffeine, and surface water 3, which we were not able to sample for due to lack of water in that surface water site on that day. This shows over baseline in blue during a storm event on October 22nd and immediately after the storm event on October 27th, the caffeine samples. So what this shows is that in nearly all sites for which caffeine was sampled, there were trace amounts of caffeine in the environment, with the exception of surface water 2 on October 26th, which, as you can see, shows a full order of magnitude higher concentrations of caffeine. And so a confounding factor in this is that, as you all probably know, the Yaupan holly is a plant native to this area, and it naturally produces caffeine, actually, Ilex vomitoria. And so we can't necessarily rule out that might be contributing to these trace amounts in most of our samples, but this is likely, caffeine is very is rather rare to find naturally in the environment. So this high concentration of caffeine suggests that there was likely septic leachate interactions with this surface water 2 site on October 26th, I'm sorry, that was associated with the nutrients and bacteria present at that sample site as well. And so now I will pass it on to my colleague Elizabeth, who will talk with you about local perspectives in Nags Head. Oh, I'm so sorry. First, before I do that, sorry, I'm a little too excited. So yes, just to wrap up with the bacteria section, as our hypothesis predicted, nutrients and bacteria were highest in surface water sampling locations under storm conditions as opposed to baseline conditions. And even under baseline conditions, most surface water sites contain unsafe concentrations of E. coli and Enterococcus bacteria according to the EPA threshold standards. And caffeine was found in trace amounts in nearly all sites for which caffeine was sampled with significant concentrations at surface water 2 under storm conditions. So yes, that just suggests that, again, with the bacteria levels, that even though they're not recreational waters, they do flow into the outfall in places like this where people do recreate and where people do walk through. And so as groundwater levels rise and storms increase this frequency and intensity, that could pose a public health issue for the town of Nags Head and other coastal communities. And now, without further ado, I will pass it on to Elizabeth, who will talk with you about local perspectives in Nags Head.
Thank you, Alex. I get not one, but 2 introductions. So our final part of the project was local perspectives, and the goal of this project really came out of the socio-hydraulic cycle that my colleague Emma talked to you about earlier. And so we created an interview guide based off of this cycle, as we really wanted to understand the perceptions of beliefs of Nags Head residents. And with that being said, our interview guide wanted to encompass asking questions about what local residents are seeing with external environmental changes, as well as external anthropogenic changes. And another component in our interview guide was to ask local residents about their perceptions on wastewater treatment policies and infrastructure that's in place in Nags Head. After our interview guide was completed, we went out and conducted 27 semi-structured interviews with local residents in Nags Head. I want to stress with this that our results are only representative of our 27 participants and do not represent Nags Head as a whole. We used a snowball referral method in order to conduct these 27 interviews, which means that we started with an initial referral guide, and after our interviews were complete, we would ask our participants if they had any other recommendations for us, and so on and so forth. Finally, after our interviews were completed, we transcribed them word for word and entered them into a coding software called NVivo. NVivo allowed us to qualitatively analyze our transcripts by coding them. An example of coding may be seen here. The tourism industry is driven by the beach, so it's essential that we take steps to protect our ocean and to protect our beaches. This is not your typical type of coding, as we assigned the code tourism to this quote. Coding allowed for us to break up our transcripts into pieces and then assign meanings to them, like tourism. After we assigned the meanings, we would put the transcripts back together and analyze them and see what themes we found. So after analyzing all of our interviews, we found 4 emerging themes in our participants. The first is attachment to place in water. Second, evidence and drivers of water quality and quantity. Third, perceptions of septic risk and barriers to change. And finally, responsibility. I'm now going to turn it over to Lynn, who's going to tell you more about our first theme.
Thanks, Elizabeth. As Elizabeth mentioned, our first theme was attachments to place in water. Our participants described strong attachments to Nags Head waters and their quality of life in Nags Head, which we attributed in tandem to the development of what we refer to as their water identity. We defined water identity as encompassing one's connection to, usage, and appreciation of water, influencing one's sense of self and belonging. For example, one participant said, "I think people really feel an innate connection to the ocean, and it's almost essential that they live near the water." Water identity can be considered as a sort of place attachment, which can factor into how individuals and the community recognize change and respond to it. Such responses can include stewardship, place protection, and adaptation. We discussed this theme because participants' place attachment can motivate and influence current and future decision-making in regards to wastewater management in the face of environmental changes, which brings us to our next theme, evidence and drivers of water quality and quantity. Our participants' strong connections to water likely influence their awareness of the area's vulnerability related to concerns about Nags Head water quality and quantity. They discussed environmental observations related to changes in the water and the environment that they noticed over time, and potential drivers of such changes. Several participants talked about how individuals and the community come together to keep the beaches clean. However, bad water quality was mentioned 3 times as often as good water quality. One participant even said, "It's rainwater, and the rainwater is brown." Why? Because we have septic fields. Participants talked about concerns related to biological hazards, such as pathogens and bacteria. And all water reservoirs were mentioned in terms of the ocean, the sound, drainage ditches, and groundwater when mentioning bad water quality. Now, in terms of water quantity, participants talked about flooding and water tables rising. For example, when we started here before Matthew, this area was fine. And if you talk to the old-time residents, they would tell you they'd never. The majority of water quantity concerns discussed was in relation to flooding, and less so in terms of climate change or sea level rise. And now, in terms of drivers, or what could be causing these changes, participants then mainly talked about storms and flooding and development. In terms of storms and flooding, participants noted increased frequency and intensity. In terms of development, participants noted more people, more large beach homes, all on septic, which many participants attributed to bad water quality. For example, as the Outer Banks grows and tourism continues to increase, we're going to keep seeing more demand for denser development, and that has an impact on wastewater. Participants saw development as a driver of water quality and quantity due to it leading to increased flooding because of more standing water because of impervious surfaces. And now, I hand the floor to Connor to talk about our other 2 themes.
Thank you, Lynn. So tying it back to this current theme that Lynn just discussed, there was a lot of talk about water quality, and this was often linked back to risks posed by septic. So while there were varying levels of knowledge regarding septic systems and how they were tied into the hydrological cycle, there seemed to be an overall perception that it was contributing to poor water quality in some way. So as this person talked about here, I really just think that we have an issue with the fact that there's septic tanks sitting in groundwater, and I think that's a really big issue that a lot of people don't know about. So while many people didn't really know how the groundwater table was tied to septic, there were a decent amount of people that discussed the rising groundwater table and that water table's interaction with septic fields. However, we also asked our participants about potential alternatives to septic tanks, such as centralized wastewater treatment. And the overwhelming majority of our participants were against centralized wastewater for a variety of reasons. And one of these major reasons, as you can see in this quote here, was about their overall reluctance to make large-scale changes because they were just used to septic tanks and used to how they worked. So this, our participants noted when asked about switching to centralized that it was probably not very likely because I feel like people around here are very accustomed to how things are and it takes a lot for change to happen. So going off of this, there seemed to be a lack of knowledge regarding the logistics of switching to centralized, which was a big factor, as well as the increased costs that would be associated with it, as well as the feasibility of such a project. And another major reason for people being against centralized was that they believed that septic tanks limited density development, and while they believed that there was already a problem with overdevelopment in the area, they believed that switching to centralized would exacerbate this. So tying this into our last theme, responsibility, in all of our interviews, we asked the participants about who they think should be responsible for managing wastewater and stormwater. And the overwhelming majority believed that the town of Nags Head should be responsible for managing stormwater because the individuals were already doing as much as they could within the law and financially to mitigate flooding risks and just deal with stormwater and how it was affecting their property. They did, however, believe that individuals should be responsible for maintaining their own septic systems, but this was a large financial burden, and they believed that the town should, in some part, help with this. As you can see in this quote here, when we asked them about who they believe should be responsible, they said because if the town is dealing with septic systems and they have to deal with everything else, then why not do that as well? So they believed that the town should do something, and another major part of this was that they believed that the town, there was no central information source regarding septic. As someone discussed earlier, there was the Septic Health Initiative, but overall, there was varying levels of knowledge regarding what the town was doing and what they believed them as individual property owners could do. Lastly, in terms of responsibility, there was a lot of discussion about the community, and they believed that in order for change to happen, the community had to work together to make change happen. So to tie in all of these themes together and discuss our overall conclusions from our social science research, I'm going to hand it over to Miriam.
Thank you, Connor. I'm going to need that. So I'm here to talk to you about the conclusions of local perspectives. So the first conclusion that we found while delving through the research was that participants of Nags Head valued their waters for various reasons, including aesthetics, recreation, livelihood, and community. A second finding was that many environmental changes and concerns were due to the management of stormwater and wastewater, which because of increased flooding, because of increased intensity and frequency of storms, exacerbated flooding, decreased water quality, and increased pollution in all water reservoirs. Well, a third finding was a cascade where the Nags Head tourist economy pushed for more development. Let me see if I can get this. Development, and then development caused environmental changes such as decreased water quality due to impervious surfaces, which then affected the tourist economy. And as you could see, this cascade continues over time. A fourth finding was that septic was preferred over central sewage, largely due to financial reasons as well as logistical reasons, such as payment methods and placement potentials within the town of Nags Head. Our final finding was that overall participants were uninformed about various issues and perceived that there was no central location where they could look up issues regarding septic health and maintenance. And now I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Kat Bell, to talk about overall results and conclusions.
Thanks, Miriam. As the sea level continues to rise, we can also expect rises in groundwater levels. As we saw in the historic water level study, rises in groundwater levels could encroach upon septic drain fields. This can lead to a myriad of water quality issues, which we studied with the field study. In our field study, we found that there were spiked levels of nutrients and bacteria. In addition, because we found the presence of caffeine, this can show that this could be influenced by humans, such as septic leachate. Finally, we found in the local perspective section of our study that the property owners in this area suspected these water quality concerns. These local property owners also heavily valued the natural environment around them. And if this natural environment were to be degraded, then it would inhibit their ability to value this area, as well as negatively impact the local economy. Based on these conclusions, we have some recommendations for the future. First, for the town, in their water quality monitoring program, we recommend to better understand the water level and water quality of the local hydrology to more regularly sample and at a finer spatial resolution in some areas. Further, if the town would like the local residents to better understand how to maintain their septic tanks and to better understand information sources available to them, we recommend investing in novel ways to engage their citizens in opportunities to address these concerns. For future research, We recommend that future researchers, because we know that the Outer Banks field site is going to continue this research topic for years to come, we recommend that they continue examining human indicators and water quality concerns, because we think it will better link or help link these water quality concerns to human influence. Also, we recommend that future researchers further investigate the separation between septic drain fields and the groundwater level. Thank you. This project could not have happened without the people who contributed to it and helped us out with it. So we would like to especially thank the Outer Banks field site staff and also the employees of the town of Nags Head for helping us throughout the entire project. Also the Community Advisory Board, our internship mentors, and any community members, guest speakers, or businesses who helped contribute to our experience. Now we would like to open the floor for questions, and my fellow researchers will come up to the floor and
So I do want to mention that there is a written report that goes along with this presentation you've just seen, which I highly recommend. It's stimulating reading. The report is available on flash drives in the back of the room. If you're watching through our internet channel or just don't feel like picking up a flash drive, you can just Google OBXFS, Outer Banks Field Site, and you'll be able to download a PDF. With that, we'll open the floor for questions and observations. There's a lot of people here, so we request you sort of keep your questions brief and give the students time to answer.
First of all, great job to all the students and the faculty. It was a great presentation and very comprehensive. My question relates to, if you look at the data, if you look at the intersection in the future, when does this really, I mean, obviously there's an issue now, or at least it seems like there is, but when would you project it becomes so serious that you have to modify either septic standards or do something different? I mean, is there any look at the data that you know, going forward?
Making observations like that was outside of the scope of our study, but as you can see, there is already evidence that there is human-driven impacts to water quality. So I'd say the time is now. I mean, we're already looking at it, and this project will continue. So we can't say when it's going to become such a huge problem that it will really affect everyone, but as we have shown, it already is affecting water quality. You're welcome.
We need it for the audience online.
Okay. I'm Kathy Jorgensen, and I live in Kill Devil Hills, and this presentation was just awesome. I live on a slab, and I'm hoping that the Kill Devil Hills committee and councilmen and aldermen, everyone listens to this, because I think Kill Devil Hills has a higher population than Nags Head year-round, and I'm definitely going to make sure that that they know about this meeting today. Thank you very much, ladies.
Thank you. Any other questions? Online question.
So this is a two-part question. The first part is, do you have any indication of the intrusion or overwash of saltwater affecting the function of septic systems? I'll pause if you guys want to answer that one first.
Ocean overwash?
Yes, saltwater intrusion.
We didn't look at that in our data, but actually the human dimensions, this wasn't mentioned in our conclusions, but actually the people of Nags Head attributed all of the flooding to rainwater, and the overwhelming majority of them said that ocean overwash was not a problem, but we did not look at this data quantitatively in our field-based study.
The second part is then, can you map the depth of the water table and predict it in the future?
Yeah, it's possible. That also goes along with our recommendations of a higher resolution for studying. We have looked at the different wells, but you know, they aren't all sampled at the same time. It makes it really hard to compare the space over time. So that's why we recommend there being more regular and more spatially consistent surveying. Yes.
Hi, my name's Jim. I live in Southern Shores, and my question is, amongst your talking to residents in Nags Head, did you happen to talk to anybody from the septic industry and learn whether they've experienced, more topsoil being added in recent years for the installation of septic systems? And then my second question is there anyone here, and you can just show your hands right now, that's from the septic industry that actually installs septic systems? Bueller?
No, we did not interview anyone that at least revealed that they were part of the septic industry. We only revealed home and business owners in Nags Head. None of them said that they worked in septic. And if we had considered opening our study to include more types of people, such as government officials and other like developers or septic businesses, but unfortunately we just did not have time to do that in this study, but that's something that could happen as it continues.
Assist with that question. My name is David Ryan. I'm the town engineer for the town of Nags Head, and what we have seen here recently within the past 5 years is an increase in development of the lower lying areas that does result in more mounded septic systems for new construction. So yes, we have observed that.
Do you know if anyone's taking a proactive stance to even, like, say you're in a higher level elevation, they're actually building up their lot so the septic is actually mounded even further?
His question for the online audience before you answer it.
Okay. All right. So your question is, do we see the building pad and the septic pad, do we see an overall pad development for new construction?
Like making it so the difference from the bottom of the septic field is greater than 48 inches. Are people doing 60 inches? Are people doing?
Typically, no. No, what we are seeing is just the minimum requirement. What we see is with these lower lying areas that they have less separation to the water table or to what is referred to as a seasonal high wetness condition. So as a result of that, the state regulations require them to have meet the minimum separation requirements. And as a result, when they fill the septic pad, they also fill the building pad in order to equal that, so they can gravity feed from the residents to the septic system.
Thank you, David. I'm glad that you were here to answer that question.
Hi, my name is Ann Daisy, and I work with Dare Soil and Water Conservation District. And this goes to your results on your perception that there was not any central information source about septic systems and caring for them. Did you get any specific answers on what kind of information they're looking for besides what the town does already provide on how to care for your septic system? What did anyone mention anything specifically on information that they were looking for with that no information available to them?
Thank you for your question. So we found in our interviews that it wasn't that people thought the information source was lacking, it was just generally that they didn't know it existed. And so there was a lot of variation between where people said they got their information. Some people would just talk about their septic buddy, or they said, oh, I don't even know I have a septic tank. And so there was just a lot of variance in where people said they got their information sources. So there wasn't really a clear answer on what they think should be provided, because most of the time they just weren't aware that it was in place.
Any other questions from the in-person audience? If not, we have another online audience question.
So the town of Nags Head and other towns along the coast are still looking for areas of growth. Do you have any suggestions for policies that may be implemented that might limit future water quality problems?
So thank you for your question. From a lot of what we found both in the sociological data and hydrological data is that the increase of impervious surfaces frequently is what can be, at least in part, attributed to more flooding, which, as we discussed in our bacteria nutrients results, actually puts those contaminating materials in the water when it floods. And so a potential mitigation strategy for that is, like, as development continues, to set aside, just a suggestion, that if development is to continue, that more areas be set aside for water retention, where water can be held, like wetland areas along the Sound. There's a lot of really great examples of that. And that essentially sequesters the water that would otherwise be caught on the surface as impervious surfaces proliferate with development. So if development is to continue, something to counterbalance that would be setting aside more areas for conservation or wetlands or things that would keep that water within it, as opposed to having it end up in the streets of Nags Head.
Okay, and then as a follow-up to that, with the current rate of sea level rise, what action can current homeowners implement to deal with future problems?
So I can't speak on this personally, but we did ask a similar question within the interviews we conducted, and a lot of the answers were just personal adaptations that one could take, such as sandbags, rain garden, things of that nature that are done on an individual level. So
another thing that a lot of our participants discussed was using vegetation as a means of water retention. That was one of the big adaptations that many of our participants used to prevent against overflooding in their property.
Okay.
Over the past couple of decades, our state has seen a tremendous growth by the hundreds of thousands or millions. With that growth, infrastructure has been implemented in our state, schools, roads, et cetera, houses, which has impacted our ground with impervious areas upstream. Do you think that growth and that water coming into our tributaries could possibly affect our groundwater, drinking water? Which is a little bit, could it also affect the groundwater quality here on the coast?
So if I understand your question, are you asking like areas farther upland in rivers like New Bern and places like that, that as they increase impervious surfaces? I think for the purposes of the Outer Banks, a lot of the water that ends up flooding streets is generally rainwater. It's not necessarily coming from the Sound per se, which is where water from those tributaries and those rivers would come. Granted, with sea level rise, that could increase the water level of the Sound and then the ground table under the barrier islands, which would contribute to flooding more. But that's less the result of impervious surfaces in a place like Chapel Hill or Raleigh than it is to like thermal expansion of water that would increase the ocean water volume, if I'm not mistaken. So in short, I think that would probably have a negligible effect.
That's also a very interesting point, and as Alex said, but also that was outside of the scope of our study and would be something really interesting to look at in the future. So thank you for that as well.
I thought that your use of looking for caffeine was really interesting, and I'm wondering, to what do you attribute finding caffeine in the groundwater? And did that or any other result in your groundwater studies cause you to question what it is you're looking at in your findings? Thank you.
Yeah, caffeine is a really interesting part of our study that I thought was very cool. So our just to state up front, our analysis was very preliminary. We didn't necessarily get super precise caffeine measures, and we can't say for certain where they're coming from. We only found out rather later in the study that Ilex vomitoria, the Yaupon holly, is a naturally caffeine-producing plant, and that I believe it's endemic to this region. And so that could be contributing to the groundwater caffeine. We don't know that for certain. But the spike in surface water 2 under storm conditions we think is likely not attributable to something like Yopanhali and is a likely indicator of septic leachate interaction and has been, caffeine has been used as a water quality indicator in other studies, both in the state of North Carolina and other places as well.
In that order of magnitude where you see where those other trace amounts versus our storm conditions where it increased, that was what caused us to attribute that. But also, as I mentioned when I was talking about our filtration, we weren't able to run all of our samples across all of our sample dates as well. So there is, if we were given more time, and if without those time constraints, we would have more data with that as well.
Any other questions from the audience online or in the room? Okay. Oh.
Did y'all control for the topographic elevation of the surface of the ground versus the water table? And is there any correlation between the elevation of the water table and the elevation of the topographic surface?
Do you mean when analyzing the historical data set? Sure. Okay. So, for instance, like, so there are like deep groundwater wells and then more shallower groundwater wells, and that's because of changes in elevation. And so we do discuss that further in the report, but we didn't really talk about it as much in the presentation. So I would kind of encourage you to read the report on that one. It's just, it gets a little further explained and it's just a lot to go into. So we just kind of discuss how the water level how those elevation changes at the different wells did affect mean depth to groundwater. Does that answer your question?
So I have a question about your respondents. I thought it was really interesting that they seemed resistant to change in general, and yet they saw the responsibility of the septic system in dealing with groundwater issues as a governmental responsibility. So what would your recommendation or what are your thoughts on change at the municipality level, and how receptive would your respondents be to change that was implemented from the municipality?
So a lot of the things we noticed with our participants was that they were resistant to large-scale changes, but it seemed like a lot of that was attributed to knowledge gaps in terms of alternatives to other means of wastewater treatment. So we concluded that if there was more, as we discussed earlier, if there was more education on wastewater treatment and potential changing to a centralized system, then the participants would be more willing to change, but at the same time, they were also pretty set in their ways for the most part, and they were just used to how septic works, and so that's a big factor in why they were pretty set on remaining on septic.
Do you know if the town of Nags Head addresses a force to sewer? I'm assuming that since only, I think the percentage was 80% were on septic system, everybody else is on sewer. So I'm assuming the town of Nags Head runs the sewer system, and have they addressed a force to sewer system if septic tanks are failing as a way to switch over to the centralized system?
Yeah, so we didn't really talk much with town officials, but from what it seemed like from our participant responses, there was not much about that.
Also, the residents who are on a centralized system that's not run by the town of Nags Head. That's a separate neighborhood entity who has their own centralized treatment plant, and as well as the town and government have no means, if there is a failing septic system, to control and regulate that septic system. That is the responsibility of the homeowner to maintain and fix their septic system if it is failing. So did that answer your question? Okay.
Did you all look into the cost of septic systems versus centralized systems and what a transition would look like?
So we didn't necessarily look at a transition. However, centralized is a cheaper method as well as it is a more simple structure. Aside from financial reasons, there are other reasons why Nags Head residents do not understand why central can be put in, and a lot of that is like location or space within Nags Head and like the infrastructure that would be needed. Does that answer your question?
Okay. Did y'all do any analysis of the soil type and its impact potentially on filtering the leachate and or its impact on the water staining and turbidity of the surface waters? Soil type?
Outside the scope of our project, when we took our measurements, as far as when we were differentiating between our baseline and our storm averages, we're going on the basis that when you do have these increased storm events, you're having more sitting water that is not able to percolate, but no, not specifically attributing to soil type, just the fact that there is more standing water with this storm event. Did that answer your question? Okay.
And just to elaborate, for when referencing the depth of the drain field and the required separation from the bottom of the drain field to the top of the groundwater table, those were like typical measurements that would be met in sandy soils that would be found in Nags Head. So, but no, other than that, we didn't really analyze like soil types.
Any other questions? Okay, Phil.
Thank you, and I hope that, I know all of us hope that the experience each of you has had here on the Outer Banks has been fulfilling. And a slightly different take on your research. I'm curious if two or three of you could share with us how your experience here and the research here is informing your continuing studies, your future plans, career choices, etc. Where does this fit into the puzzle of your life?
Anybody?
So I'm from Charlotte, North Carolina, so this was definitely a very different experience on the coast, for one, and not in a large city. I thoroughly enjoyed my time spent here, both in Manio and Wanchese, and working with the town of Nags Head. I hope to continue in my route of local government regulation law, as well as my interest in environmental science are to do with water allocation distribution. So this fit very well with what I want to study in the future. So I'm very glad that I have this research experience.
So I'm from outside of Baltimore, and I do have my house is on a septic system, and coming into this, I was not knowledgeable at all about how septic systems worked. But my career interests do include water as a resource and how it's becoming more of an issue with rising sea level. And so my time in the Outer Banks definitely was helpful in kind of guiding where I want to go, and it's definitely something that needs to be studied because it's becoming more of an issue. So.
Cool. So yeah, I was actually born in Seattle, Washington. So, but growing up mostly in North Carolina was a lot different from that. And I've actually never been outside the United States. So coming here was as abroad as I've ever been. And, but I've had a great time here, like getting to know all my classmates and my professors. And interning with Sam at the Outer Banks Voice was really fun. and did impact what I think I might pursue in my future career, because I'm interested in how to communicate about the environment and science to the general public, and kind of about environmental behavior and decision making, and helping different stakeholders and groups of people like that connect and collaborate. And so this field site was perfect for that, I think.
We'll all be available afterward. I don't know if we want to go entirely down the line or not, but we'll all be available afterwards and would love to share our experience with you, as we all had a wonderful time here. But yeah.
Thank you all for coming to this capstone presentation of the Outer Banks Field Site 2018. We all appreciate your engagement and your help in making this semester a success, including coming to this final presentation. Do please feel free to stay after to speak with the students. Please pick up a copy of the report and stay tuned, because this project will continue if the town of Nags Head is still willing to work with us.